Hey guys, this is AP World History, Chapter 20, Worlds Apart, the Americas and Oceania. So today we're going to focus on the Americas, more so in particular on the Aztecs and the Incas, as well as Oceania area. We're not going to focus too much on the Northern American natives. For the most part, they're not really talked about on the AP World History exam. So we're just going to focus on the Aztecs, the Incas, and the Oceania. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing we're going to talk about are the Toltecs and the Mexica. So the Mexica were one of several groups of migrants in the mid 13th century. They had this tradition of kidnapping women, seizing, cultivating land. So, just more so just a warrior people than anything else. Not necessarily looking to create peace and to settle down necessarily, but more so to conquer. And they fought with neighbors, and because of this, they moved several times because they obviously could not keep peace in the areas that they were in. Tenochtitlan, this was settled in 1345 CE in what was Lake Texcoco, and later when the Europeans come in, it will be Mexico City. When the Aztecs take over, Tenochtitlan will be the capital. It was an island, and there were advantages from the lake. Obviously, one of them was that they had a source of water right around them. Another was that it was good for protection, as well as that you were able to have fertile land. So they dredged soil from the bottom of the lake to create fertile plots of land known as chinampas. And the chinampas were so fertile that it was said that you could have up to 7 crops per year. So that kind of tells you what a benefit it was to be geographically located where they were. And like I said, it was also a natural defense against other people who would want to attack them. So the Aztec Empire, the Mexicas will develop a tributary empire by the 15th century because they became stronger than their neighbors. The Aztecs will pretty much go around and conquer their neighboring lands. As they conquer them, they're going to get tribute from them. Some of the leaders were Itzcotl and Montezuma, and Aztecs will join Texcoco and Tlacopan to create the Aztec Empire. So you can't think of it as like this one empire and they just grew and grew and grew. Rather, it was almost an alliance system with the Texcoco and the Tlacopan that created the Aztec Empire. And for the most part, the creation of the empire was just for tributary purposes. They really didn't have an elaborate bureaucracy. It wasn't like, okay, we're the Aztec Empire and now we're going to have a king and everybody under us. More so, it was more the fact that we're an Aztec Empire, we're going to collect tribute from the people around us, and they can have their little governments. So they didn't have military garrisons. They only gathered military if they were going to expand or if they were going to conquer. So I just kind of want to show you the map so you can get an idea of what we're talking about, the areas. So the Aztec Empire is this area in the green over here, Tenochtitlan right there in the center, like I said, this little island area. And then here's a more detailed one right here. So it'd be just this little area right there. And then the Toltecs were this, you can kind of barely see it, this little area here next to Cholula. And then the Maya Empire was at the Yucatan Peninsula. And remember, the Mayas came before the Aztecs. So in terms of society, you did see obviously this hierarchical social structure, especially for the military. The warriors had a very, very high status in the Aztec Empire, which made sense since they were a conquering people. And most of the time, these warriors were coming from these aristocratic families. And the better the warrior you were, the more kind of benefits that you got. The best warriors formed councils to select rulers and decide who was going to be in charge of them. These warriors would also discuss issues and fill other government positions. If you were a good warrior, some of the forms of payment in terms of kind of saying thank you would be like you receiving land grants or having better privileges. In addition, kind of the way you were dressed was going to be in nicer, fancier clothes than if you were just like a common fighter, a common warrior. So really the warriors held high prestige in this Mexica society. In terms of the Mexica women, Obviously, they're living in this patriarchal structure. You're not going to inherit any property. You're under the strict authority of men, so whatever the man says is what's going to happen. There was this emphasis on childbearing, the idea that you wanted to bear the best man, especially the best little boy who was going to be this great warrior someday, because that's what they thought. They were going to be future soldiers. So mothers of warriors were especially lauded. If you were the mother of a warrior who, did some awesome conquering in a battle, then you were going to have similar honors as well. Even mothers that lost their children in childbirth, they were also viewed as having high status as well. We also see the priests here. They're the masters of complex agricultural and ritual calendars. They, are the ones that are making sure that life is continuing according to their religion in the day. So they're going to perform ritual functions. They'll read omens. They'll advise the rulers. Sometimes the priest did become the ruler at times. We see this with Montezuma. He was considered a priest and a ruler. Cultivators and slaves. We have communal groups called the Kalpuli. These were pretty much like family groups that worked together on the farms. First, that's how they were created. Originally, they're kin-based. Later on, they'll become more communal. And the work of obligation they'll work on the aristocratic lands because it's their obligation to. And most of whatever they grow is given to the aristocracy to feed them and provide for them. In addition to this, if it's not going to the aristocracy, it's going as a form of tribute as well. You also see them working as domestic servants. So they could possibly be working for a higher nobility. And we saw slaves that also existed in the society. And these were usually debtors, people who owed some sort of money to somebody. Or sometimes children were sold into slavery to pay off a debt. So one of the two is often what we saw. In addition, you would also see prisoners of war who would be slaves. But most of the time, the prisoners of war would be given up for human sacrifice, if not already killed. In regards to artisans and merchants in the society, very prestigious in Mexica society if you were an artisan or a merchant. And you supplied exotic products through trade, especially the merchants. They were the ones that, if there was something that you wanted that wasn't native to the land, they were probably the ones that could go and get it for you and find it for you. Extortion from aristocratic warriors as well occurred, though. So if for some reason, the warriors felt that what you were doing was wrong, they could, accuse you of it and then kind of take your goods. So in that way, they would extort the goods that the merchants had. Mexica religion, we see the Mexica gods. Tezcatlipoca, this was also known as the smoking mirror god, and it was the god of life and death, the life giver and death provider, patron god of warriors as well. And then we also see Quetzalcoatl, and that's the arts and crafts and agricultural god that they would pray to. And then Huitzilopochtli, that is the kind of like the patron of the Mexica. This was the god that they felt they had to give blood sacrifices to. So ritual bloodletting, like I said, was very common in the Aztec culture. It's what they thought they needed to do every day in order to in order to have the next day come. So it's a more emphasis on human sacrifice than other cultures, more emphasis than what we saw with the Mayans. The idea that the blood gave moisture to let the maize and other crops grow. If we remember the creation story that we heard with the Popol Vuh, with the Mayans, the idea that, maize and water created it, then this idea of blood was kind of like what was giving the moisture to help the crop grow as well. Sacrificial victims had tips of their fingers torn off before death or other ritual wounds. It was the idea that you're bloodletting first before you kill. So, yeah, the tips of your fingers would cut off and you just let the blood drip, or the way it says personal rituals like piercing the penis or the earlobes, and you would get like maybe a long thorn and you would just pull it through the penis, or you would pull it through the ear loops just to let that blood out. So Huitzilopochtli, this was the god, and their devotion for bloodletting came from this deity, where it had to be continuous. Usually the victims, like I said, were Mexica criminals or captured enemy soldiers, and for them, they really thought this was essential to the world's survival. This is how the next day is going to come. So it was very much an important part of their lives. They didn't see it as torture or anything like that. All right, so the next group we're going to talk about, next peoples we're going to talk about are the Incas. So the Inca Empire, the settlement around Lake Titicaca happened around mid-13th century. It really was Pachacuti who will expand the territory and really make the Inca Empire what it was. And it'll embrace pretty much Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina. So it was pretty much the largest empire that South America had ever seen. And they ruled as a military and administrative elite. They kidnapped neighboring ruling classes and forced them to live in the Inca capital and to kind of provide their expertise with whatever they needed in terms of administration. And they offered land and economic benefits to those who would submit. So it's either you do it by force or you submit to us, and this could be available to you. So the Inca administration, you had the Incas ruled by holding hostages or colonization. These were the ways that they were going to expand their land. They implemented taxes for rulers and administration that was around them, and they created a network of roads. This was probably one of the more famous achievements of the Incas were these stone roads. It was thought to believe that they were more modern than the European roads at the time, or than anything that you had seen in the other side of the world. So it was important also because it's what kept all of the empire together through these roads. They would send their runners to, send messages back and forth through these roads. So roads very important for the Incas. The other thing we see is the Q-Pu. So this was not a writing system. The Incas did not have a writing system per se, but rather they used systems of cords and knots called the Q-Pu. So it's like, imagine kind of just a long, almost like necklace looking thing, and hanging from it are these knots, are these long cords, and they're tied in a bunch of knots. And it was a mnemonic aid, and they used it mainly just to keep record of probably business transactions, maybe population, properties, taxes, so just various things. And depending on what they were keeping track of also led to what color they would be. So again, just very quickly, so you know, the Inca Empire is this area right here. So the coming of the Incas, the Cusco was the capital of the Inca Empire, and the residents were of high nobility. You also had priests and hostages that were in the area also, and you had gold facades on the buildings as well. And like I said already, with the Inca roads, there was a massive road building system. This is an example of one of the roads that it still exists today. And it was kind of like a two-way street. You had ones going north and south roads. And they were approximately 10,000 miles. You had one mountain route, and then you had another coastal route for the roads. And like I said, they would send runners on these roads to go and deliver messages from one part of the empire to another. So a lot of the times they were paved. You had shade, so in case they made a stop, and they were wide. They were wide roads. So couriers and messenger services were used for this, like I had mentioned, and it limited the long distance trade, and it held by the government monopoly. So one of the things about the roads was that you really couldn't do any long distance trade because the roads were government controlled. And also there wasn't a lot of different neighboring areas or people to trade with necessarily. So trade, like I said, was more local. You had long distance trade was more governmental. Like if it was going to happen, it was because the government was sending a group of people out to go trade for a certain item. But it wasn't that you had these independent merchants. So No independent merchants that existed. It was going to be, if it's going to be long distance, it's going to be the government that decides who goes. Ruling elites, these were social elites dominated by an infallible king, a king that could not, be destroyed, be discounted, or anything like that, because they claimed descent from the sun. And they were worshipped by the ancestors, and they said that the remains preserved and mummified from where they were, so that they would regularly consult these ancestors, and they'd offer sacrifice and paraded on festive occasions. So ruling elites were very important because they also had that connection to the ancestors, the people of the past. Aristocrats were also in the Inca Empire. They would receive special privileges, again, similar to the Aztec Empire. One of the things that you would see were earlobe spools as adornment. That was a sign of like your prestige and your status. Priestly class was more ascetic, meaning if you were a priest, it was just going to be a stricter way of life. You weren't going to necessarily show off so much. And you were celibate. The idea that you were not, having sex or doing any of that kind of stuff. And it deeply influenced society because they were educated. That was very important, that they were educated. In terms of peasants were organized into communities called the Ayllu. So this is similar to the Capillu that the Aztecs have. They had land, tools held communally. This was all, they kind of all worked together to grow crops. Mandatory work details on land of aristocrats. So again, similar to the Aztecs in that sense, where if you're a peasant or you're the lower class, you're going to work for the nobility if you have to. And they also, in the Inca Empire, did public works as well. In terms of gods, Inti was the sun god, and that was probably the most famous god that the Incas worshipped. You also had Viracocha, who was the creator god, and this god was the one that Pachacuti, the Earthshaker ruler, that he preferred to worship. And then you would go and have temples as pilgrimage sites where people would go and, take their pilgrimage to these holy places. And peasant sacrifices, usually produce or animals, not ever humans, if they were going to give sacrifice. So that would be a difference between the Incas and the Aztecs. Okay, Aztecs, human sacrifice, whereas Incas were more animals and not humans. Moral thought also existed with the Incas. You see this idea of sin. This was something that they kind of developed in their own society. We really don't see this in any other societies until we get into Europe and with Christianity. But in terms of this area, yeah, sin was understood as a disruption of the divine order and of any like social behavior. They believed in life beyond death as well in terms of moral thought. So this idea that if you're sinning or doing something bad, then that's going to affect you beyond death. So sin brought disaster for individuals in the community, and so it was important that it was trying to be prevented. Okay, so now we're moving on to the Pacific Island societies. Just very quickly, because things really don't change necessarily so much in these areas. You still have these long distance voyagings, which makes sense because just of the distance between one island to another. And it was happening obviously on an intermittent basis because of the length. Some of the things that were brought between islands were sweet potatoes from South America. Voyages also helped to preserve oral traditions, so you would pass down the stories through your experiences from one person to another. We also saw population growth through extensive cultivation. There were new ways of fishing. Also, the development of fish ponds allowed for small fish to be in there, as well as they were able to trap larger fish and kind of grow those fish as well. Population density, of course, is going to lead to social strife because you have to provide for more people. And it will also lead to economic degradation as well. And by 1500 CE, you see fierce fighting and cannibalism between or within Pacific Island societies. The development of social classes. There's a complexity of population leads to articulation of distinct classes. So similar to all other societies we've talked about, you're going to see this hierarchical level where you have somebody at the top and then you have the people below them. In this case, you have your high chiefs and then the lesser chiefs, the commoners, the artisans, and the peasants. And it wasn't necessarily always easy for the high chief to maintain control. So the formation of chiefly states. Small multi-island empires will begin to form, and it's going to be limited before the 19th century. And like I said, because you're an island, it becomes difficult to expand. So yet controlled land allocation, labor, and military conscription existed, meaning that yes, your land is controlled. This is all you have, but we need workers to work the land. We need military people to be in the government as well. I mean, not in the government, to be in the military to, help fight in case you're attacked by a neighboring islander. And then lastly, Polynesian religion. Priests were, again, seen as intermediaries to the divine. So, again, similar to the other societies of the Americas, priests are those intermediaries. You had gods of war that existed as well. Agricultural gods were also prominent. And, of course, you had ceremonial centers as well. All right, so that's pretty much the Americas with emphasis on the Aztecs, the Incas, and then, of course, moving on to the Pacific with Oceania. All right, so we will see you guys later.